All right, students, well, welcome to Chapter 13, Road to the Civil War, and our, what I call the bonus unit. I really felt it was important to focus in and give you guys a little bit more history and background on the Underground Railroad. It's a very important section of when we learn about how slaves tried to find freedom during this era leading up to the Civil War. And there's quite a few notable characters and people that come out of here. So I just really wanted to spend just a few minutes going over a little bit of the information about the Underground Railroad so you guys have a historical backing for it. So let's just jump right into it. So what was it? Well, the Underground Railroad was formed and created as a way to help slaves find safe passage out of the South and up into the North. And the North can mean anywhere from just being resettled into northern states, but some of them also escaped all the way into Canada. And sometimes Canada was a better option for some of them due to the fact that the Fugitive Slave Law came into play. So later on, when we look at the Underground Railroad, you will see that escaped slaves try to push themselves further north and up into Canada or further west in order to try to maintain their freedom once they escaped. Another fascinating aspect about it is that there's no centralized structure to the Underground Railroad. So it works with independent groups and people volunteer to work for it, and they can quit anytime or they can join anytime. But it really was designed to ensure that if one person was caught running operations in the Underground Railroad, that the entire system would not just collapse in on itself. And this happens frequently if you study history, where you have a strong upper power structure, it gets compromised and the other portions of it completely fall apart. The Underground Railroad was built to protect and prevent that from happening. There was a number of people who worked in it. Often you would find white abolitionists who would work into it. This would vary from everybody from people who'd financially support it to people providing homes to people providing goods and services, but you also have a lot of freed African Americans who had escaped slavery who wanted to help. Harriet Tubman's a key one on that one when you look at it. She's an escaped slave and helps numerous other ones find freedom. But it's made up of a large collection of individuals. So it's a really dynamic group that are really working to help gain freedom for African Americans. Actual numbers of how many people escaped are not clearly known because it's a secretive organization. It's estimated between 40,000 to 100,000 people were helped to escape slavery using the Underground Railroad. When does it start? Well, it's really fascinating. It's been around since the early portions of the creation of the United States. Probably even earlier than that, because Quakers tend to be anti-slave even from the beginning. And some of the very earliest abolitionists were Quakers in general. So one of the things that Washington notes is that as his slaves escaped, he says, a society of Quakers formed for such purposes are the ones that are allowing my slaves to escape. So he knows, and most other people know, that a lot of times this is tied to religious and abolitionist groups and people who are sympathetic to the cause of abolitionism. So often these are the people that are pushing for it, but it really starts to take off, and you see large-scale activities in what we know as the Underground Railroad starting about 1810-ish, and really ramps up really close to 1850. And the thing is that they take railroad terminology, because there's a rise of railroads starting in the United States, and they use it to try to code how they're moving people and what different things mean in order to try to confuse people that might be searching for fugitive slaves. And it's helpful to use terminology that is not well known directly to people you're trying to hide from. So there's a lot of terms that they use, so let's look at them really quickly. So, for example, you have tracks, and those are basically the routes that African Americans would take in order to find freedom. They would often lead to major cities so that they would be able to integrate into a population up there instead of trying to settle like out in the country. Stations are homes. As you can see, there's pictures over here on the side. Those are actual homes that were used as stations on the Underground Railroad. Some of them are still preserved today, and even if you wanted to go out and travel, you could find them. Depots, those were locations where slaves could stop and pick up supplies and money. So supplies could be everything from just food and shoes, but often they would try to improve their clothing because with escaped slaves, they were not given new clothes frequently. Often you'd only get a new pair of clothes every year, so they needed to make sure you didn't look tattered and torn as you were walking around so people would know that you're an escaped slave. You have the station masters, those are people who run the depots. You have stockholders, those are people who supply money and material support. You have conductors, that's what Harriet Tubman was. She would actually go down there and sneak onto plantations and help slaves move out of there. And it is when you look at it, is legitimately the most dangerous job because they're responsible for taking them and moving them along. And if they're captured, and if they're an escaped slave or a former African American, you can guarantee that they were going to lose their life. And lastly, the fugitive slaves were referred to everything from passengers to cargoes to fleets to freights, and sometimes they'd even be called ticket holders. We just talked about the conductors. Excuse me. One of the key points, though, when they're traveling, they only do so at night, but they do try to move pretty quickly. And you can't move using horses. That would be too obvious. So often they're on foot, and they're going through the wooded areas, trying to stay off main trails. And they try to move as far as they could before daylight. And then they would usually meet up at the next station where they would rest for the night, and they would sleep. Stations varied dramatically from each other. As you've seen, there were houses, some were churches, some of them were hay barns, anywhere that would be safe that they could hide and be able to stay out of prying eyes when they were out moving around. And again, that's why they did most of their movement at night. Again, the journey itself, though, is dangerous. When you really look at it, if you were caught as an escaped slave, there's a lot of different things that could occur to you by your master, him being angry at you. Some of the very first ones would be typically a lot of corporal punishment that slave owners use was whipping. Other things they would do is they would brand you so that then they knew that you belonged to them. Take a hot poker and burn it into your flesh so that then they could mark you in the future as one of their slaves if you ever escaped again. There was other programs such as they would put heavy chains and then they would have them, like a blacksmith, take a hot nail and bang it into the chains themselves so you couldn't just pull them off. You'd literally have to have them cut off. And lots of times they would be heavy chains, so it would make it very hard to move around. And these chains could be on for the rest of your life in some cases. So they were definitely not pleasant. Other slaves would get their feet cut off, one or two, to prevent them ever from running away again. Again, you're thinking about people who see these humans as property, so they wouldn't want to, quote unquote, damage them too much. So they probably would remove one foot so they can continue to work in their fields. Again, when we talked about conductors, if you were caught and you were an escaped slave, you were going to die. That's pretty much it. If you were a white conductor and you were captured, you were for certain going to face jail time in the South. So even if you were a white person helping out on the Underground Railroad, you could face significant consequences. But again, as we've talked about with these escaped slaves and the black conductors, they would be hung immediately. So there was just no quarter for it. Lots of resources, though, were provided. Again, lots of people up north provided money. A lot of new clothing. And one of the other things is that money was needed to help move people via boat and rail eventually when they made it to the north, to help them get even further away from the South quicker and away from the mobs that would be hunting them. One of the fascinating ones, if you see that picture down in the corner, one of the individuals, he was actually packaged up in a box that had food and water stored inside the box, and his friends actually sent him via the mail to escape the South. So there was definitely interesting things about it. The people who raised money, they come from a variety of sources. They were known as vigilant communities. But what these communities would do more than anything else is, yes, they provided money in order to help fund the Underground Railroad and fund for supplies, but they would also help people once they were in the community. That's one of their greatest benefits, is that they would provide money so people could get a new start on life. They'd be able to purchase maybe somewhere to live. They would also get letters of recommendations to help them find jobs, or they would hire them directly themselves. But they really tried to integrate them into the community to make them safe. Because once they were seen as a full-fledged working African American, it would be harder for some fugitive slave posses to try to come in and capture them and take them back without other people intervening and protecting them. Other things they would try to do is, of course, educate them. So some of the notable people that you would know from the Underground Railroad, well, Levi and Catherine Coffin, he was considered the president of the Underground Railroad. He actually owned a really large estate, and he was well known for keeping a lot of escaped slaves there on their way north and out and into freedom. He provided a lot of financial assistance too. If you guys remember Madman John Brown, who tried to leave a massive slave revolt, Owen Brown, his father, worked as a station master, and that's where John Brown really develops this feeling that he's destined to try to help free slaves. Stephen Meyer, he was an escaped slave. He wrote newspapers. And Harriet Tubman, of course, the most famous conductor, helped over 300 people to find freedom using the Underground Railroad. All right, guys, this is just a short one. Make sure you guys have a little more context and understanding as to what the Underground Railroad was and why we talk about it. All right, guys, I will see you tomorrow. Have yourself a good rest of the day. Don't forget to do our quiz assignment.